So, like I said, probably the best place to start is a little bit about yourself, your background, what animates you, and how that led to you taking on the task of writing this incredibly rich and detailed book on the life of the Bill Gates of old.
Well, when I came out of college, I was working in corporate America in New York City, and I'd always dreamed of being a writer, but it's real difficult to break into that business. But the avenue I found was to get into business writing, and I did a series of business books that were all historically oriented. And I always included a piece by Andrew Carnegie. And I just became enthralled by his personality. He's hypnotic in certain ways. And he was also a very progressive thinker as a businessman. So it was the business books were a great stepping stone to do a biography on him. And also my family roots are in Pittsburgh, and my great-grandfather worked in a Carnegie mill. So I had that connection, which also gave me an emotional attachment to the subject.
Fascinating. So what business books that you had chosen Carnegie to be your kind of master quoter? People that...
Well, they were anthologies, collections of essays, and Carnegie was a prolific writer. Wrote on everything, considered himself an expert on everything. So I always found something appropriate, whether it be about business management, leadership, even investing. And I just wanted to be able to show that we're often reinventing the wheel. And when you go back to these tycoons who were really building America during the Industrial Revolution, they were coming up with ideas we still use today.
So let's talk more about him, the person. What made him tick? Why was...
Well, Carnegie was born in Scotland, and during this, he was born in 1835. And when he was a young boy in the 1840s, that was a very tough time, a lot of destitution, economic downturn. And his family really couldn't make a go of it. His father was a handloom weaver who lost his job to the factories. And so they immigrated to Pittsburgh in 1848. He's 12 years old. He takes his first job in a cotton mill. So he knew what it was like to work on a factory floor. And what he really wanted more than anything was to be able to give his family and himself the comforts that he saw around him, the fancy carriage, the mansion, the servants. And it was really even more so for his mother, who drove the family to come to this country. She was a driving force in the family, very strong personality, and he wanted to reward her. He also never wanted to have that I guess the best way to put it is the wolf of hunger knocking, at his door. And it just drove him through his whole life. He could have retired comfortably at the age of 30, but he went on for another 35 years and amassed the greatest fortune known at that time. So that was one driving force. Also, he was from a family of radicals in Scotland that were still fighting for the right to vote, the right to own property. And so when he came here, he wasn't going to let anyone in a country where people are free dictate terms to him. So what you find about Carnegie is that he was very much an individual. He was still a radical. He was still fighting for what he thought was right. He was definitely a man of convictions.
As I'm listening to you, I'm recalling Alexander Graham Bell, his family coming from Scotland over here and being a great, obviously the great inventor. He's also connected to this story in another way too. Did the two of them ever have any interactions?
I didn't come across any significant interactions. They may have passed in the same social circles at one time or another, okay, but they didn't have any business dealings.
No big deal, just a curiosity in passing. All right, so real briefly, this ties in with our Theodore Roosevelt conversation. We were talking to the man who's responsible for the Theodore Roosevelt Historical Society. He mentioned that Roosevelt and Carnegie didn't get along too well.
No, when you look at Roosevelt and Carnegie's relationship, you have two men with very big egos. And Roosevelt was really the first president who had a big enough personality where he was willing to take on the tycoons of the age, whether it be Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan. And Roosevelt had his perspectives on how business should be run. So he was willing to step outside the realm of politics and try and dictate to these men. And at the same time, men like Carnegie felt like they knew how the political machinery should work. So they were willing to step outside their realm of business and try and dictate to Roosevelt. So they were always butting heads. But they were very similar in many respects, and that's probably why.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, there was some thing that Roosevelt had great respect for his philanthropic work later. Had a disdain for how he made his money. And in particular had problems with him about what would be almost an idealistic pacifism with respect to world affairs rather than make sure you're carrying your stick the right way.
Right. Carnegie believed later in life in arbitration at any cost, peace at any cost, and that was very idealistic. And of course Roosevelt was much more of a realist when it came to war and the need to defend a country's honor. And as far as how Carnegie made his money, he made millions on munitions that he sold to the U.S. government, to the Department of War. So you get the sense that perhaps he was a hypocrite, and Roosevelt had good reason to disdain the way Carnegie made some of his money anyway, and then to come out later as a pacifist.
There's a term robber baron. Is that applicable to Carnegie?
It is. Robber barons like Carnegie, Rockefeller, shipping magnates, they made their money by cutting illegal deals with the railroad companies so that they could ship their products at reduced rates that their competitors weren't getting. And that's where the term started to originate as applied to these businessmen. Of course, the robber barons of old were in Germany, and as you were sailing your ship loaded with goods down the Rhine River, they would throw up a chain link fence across the river, stop you, and take what they thought was appropriate and then let you go on your way. So it does apply to Carnegie because he made millions by cutting illegal deals to get a rebate.
So then the analogy to Gates might hold up a little bit. Together, but the idea of being Napoleonic in some ways in dealing with your marketplace.
Right. Definitely.
Okay. So if there's anything else that you think would be an important background piece to why Carnegie would have a sensitivity to the spelling issue, why he would even be open to it. Maybe we could talk about that, and if not, let's go into what was the beginning of the spelling.
Okay. Well, before Carnegie made his fortune in steel, he actually dreamed of being the next Horace Greeley. He wanted to get into writing, become a newspaper man, and when you look at his letters that he crafted, that he would send to his managers or friends, even from a young age, he's paid a lot of attention to language, punctuation. It meant a great deal to him. And actually, I came across letters where his managers had written to him, and he would go through and edit those letters, put a little review on them, and then send them back to his manager. So he loved language, and he loved to play with it. He had some very powerful letters to one of his managers that actually were so strong that this manager had a nervous breakdown, and it took him years to recover from it. It was a series of 3 letters. So he knew the power of the written language. So that gives you an idea.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. So, where does the spelling reform thing begin with him?
Well, Carnegie sells his business in 1901 to J.P. Morgan and, of course, a consortium of bankers. And he now has over $300 million at his disposal. And he has his various pet projects. But in retirement, something that really grabs his imagination is the peace movement. He wants world peace more than anything. And he'll eventually spend about $25 million on various peace initiatives. Now, one of those initiatives is to create a universal /world language. And of course, he wants it to be English. So, let me see here.
We're stuttered here for a second.
Yeah.
Equate the 1901 dollars to today.
Okay.
Yeah, you start off going back to, he retired and hit $300 million, which is like...
Okay. That when Carnegie was at the height of his wealth in retirement, he was actually worth a little over $100 billion in today's dollars. There was an economist a few years ago who looked at the numbers and the various indexes, and he would only be bested by Rockefeller. So even our, Bill Gates is a poor third at 80 billion.
Excellent. All right.
So anyway, let's see, we're talking about his peace initiatives. Right. He felt that if English became the world language, nations would be able to communicate better, and they would be able to work out their differences better. I mean, it was a very simple formula from his perspective. Now, the question is, how does that get traction? And it often took someone else to prod Carnegie in a particular direction. In this case, it was a 1903 letter from Melville Dewey, a New York State librarian who helps develop the Dewey system, named after him, of course. And in that letter, Dewey encourages Carnegie to fund a simplified spelling movement. And what grows from that is the spelling board. And that is originally organized in 1906, officially constituted in 1907. Simplified Spelling Board, yeah.
Now, originally it was called Simplified Spelling Society, I think, and it was at his encouragement that it was renamed the Spelling Board because it was less onerous or less...
I think what Carnegie wanted to do was to appeal to a broad base of people, the mass of people. So the word society, of course, conveys something highbrow and something not for everyone. So I think he did want to appeal to everyone. Now, let's see.
I want to move up the...
Well, let's see. So it definitely officially comes in existence in 1907. That's when the board is officially constituted, and he funds it that year. But I have Carnegie, he finally bails in 1915, right? So he's going to carry it on. And we could talk about that because what he does is he forces his trusts and foundations to adopt the language. But what you have happening is a lot of the people associated with those trusts and foundations reject it. They rebel. And I think finally in 1915, he just throws up his hands and that's it. But I had Roosevelt adopting some of the reformed spelling in his writing.
It goes all the way up to the presidency and then explodes in the national media in late 1906. So by 1907, people are bailing from it. So it's curious that timing that they would just be... Now, it could be that there's an overlap, that the momentum of constituting this organization and the aftermath of the mess with the press come close together in 1907.
I think probably what happens is you have a name like Carnegie attached to this kind of movement. People immediately suspect something fishy, or they're immediately looking for an alternative agenda that's being driven by Carnegie. Because you have a man who's already professed publicly that he considers himself a trustee of civilization, and that because he made so much money, he knows how best to spend it and how best to govern society. So as soon as he funds the spelling board with an endowment of $170,000 and commits to $25,000 annually, red flags go up.
Yeah, excellent. This fits in with what our understanding of the sequence, and we'll just play with this a little bit and pick into this, connect where it works for you. like I said, beginnings form in the 1880s, and at one point there's a couple hundred signatories, including the Commissioner of Education in the United States, the Supreme Court justices, William James, the Mr. Funk, Mr. Wagnalls, all of the who's who of literary American and English society. They all agree we got to do something about this. Somewhere in the mix of this, Carnegie gets involved. You're dating it at 1903. That's great. But in 1906, in March of 1906, Brander Matthews, you encountered the name in he's the professor of English at Columbia University, and he takes over the kind of leadership of the Simplified Spelling Society / board as Dewey fades away, going into some period, such that in 1906, he and Theodore Roosevelt are discussing this. Theodore Roosevelt has a photographic memory. He can remember page 192 content by memory, but he can't spell very well. So he says this is a great idea, and in August of 1906 issues a presidential order to the Office of Government Printing to adopt these 300 word spellings, and now the Office of Printing is supposed to print every government document this way. Congress comes back in, and because this happens during the summer break in Congress. Congress comes back in and says, wait a minute, presidents can't be doing this kind of thing. The Supreme Court gets involved. The Supreme Court says, look, we're not going to touch this. You guys work this out yourself. Congress finally passes a resolution forbidding presidents from messing with the spelling of our language. But the real killer is that a number of newspapers, particularly one in Boston, basically says this whole thing is a scheme aimed at what they used the word was jobbery, right? Financed by Carnegie, so that he would make money on all of the new books that would have to be sold if he changed the spelling. This creates such a stink. I mean, this is our cartoon of it, okay? This creates such a stink that these luminaries that had been associated with it start to pull away. It's like it's a publicly stinky thing to be associated with. It's like, are you a communist? Are you a board? You're a simplified spelling reformer? And that the embarrassment and ridicule was originally focused on attacking Roosevelt, but it bled over. It was a political attack on Roosevelt for him getting on about it. The newspapers accused him of playing God. There's a great picture of him shooting at a dictionary, all this kind of stuff. So somehow Carnegie's involvement was seen as suspicious, or at least used that way in the smear campaign against this.
Right. And that's the way it was with many of Carnegie's funding of public institutions. For example, when he founded the Carnegie Institute, which is now Carnegie Mellon today, and built the buildings there, the assumption was that he was actually building those buildings to then turn them into factories. And he wanted the engineers and managers to already be there. So there was always that underlying profit motive that people immediately grabbed onto. And with Simplified Spelling Board, it was the same way. But Carnegie really was an idealist. He really, truly wanted world peace. And in fact, when World War I broke out, he had a nervous breakdown, and he was never the same man. So that I think tells you how emotionally he was tied to the peace movement. So there's always going to be the critics, the people in the gallery, in the peanut gallery, attacking him. But in this situation, I think it was unfounded, at least the reasons for them attacking him. It may have been a silly movement or considered a silly movement by a majority of people, but he was honest and he really was a man of convictions, which is why he carried on even after those attacks started.
Do you recall anywhere in your research his response to what happened in the media and this thing with Roosevelt?
Well, his rebuttal was, look, you've had Old English, you've had Middle English, and now we're in a new period of history. The spelling of very simple words like the word fish has changed radically in the last few hundred years. So why shouldn't we continue to change spellings so they are more simplified? That was his argument, which was fairly legitimate.
Is there any other conversations with other heavyweights in this simplified spelling movement that you recall Carnegie engaging in?
Well, there was a number of letters exchanged between him and Teddy Roosevelt. And in Carnegie's letters to Roosevelt, he was always tying this movement into the arbitration between countries, so there would not be wars, arbitration at all costs. So in his mind, he very much linked simplified spelling, better communication, peace between nations. So he always tied that in when he was speaking to Roosevelt. I think that was the heaviest hitter, you know.
That's great. That was a beautiful jewel. How about Mark Twain? Did he ever?
Mark Twain and Carnegie had a love-hate relationship because Carnegie worshipped Twain. And Twain was one of those men who, while he would ridicule a man like Carnegie, was definitely intoxicated by being in his presence, Rockefeller's presence, Morgan's. He loved the praise they lavished on him. He loved the posh settings that they would entertain him at. So it was a funny relationship. And Twain had been poking fun at Carnegie for decades by the time you get to the simplified spelling movement. He would write Carnegie and ask him to send him a prayer book and then reverse himself and say, no, just send me the $5 instead and I'll buy my own prayer book. So they had a fun relationship. But Twain certainly took his shots at Carnegie.
There's a point that I was referring to earlier where Twain is making these speeches, and he gets behind Pittman's simplified alphabet scheme and moves away from spelling. He doesn't think, he blames it being a alphabet invented by some drunken thief. He's got all of these descriptions for the inadequacies of the alphabet, and blames Carnegie for moving the world in the wrong direction about this fundamental reform that's needed in the code. Is there anything that you recall that Carnegie thought or said about the attack from Mark Twain, or was that just kind of a satirical roast happening on the sidelines?
There was definitely the satirical roast happening on the sidelines. And I think Twain was on board in the beginning, except that the simplified spelling movement went too far. If we were just going to deal with a narrow set of words to start with, that would be okay. But all of a sudden it exploded into a movement that was trying to change the spelling of hundreds of words instead of just, say, 30 words. And I think that when he saw that explosion occur and Carnegie pushing it to such a degree, that's when he got turned off.
So this goes on. Is there any other parts of the story that you recall or that you're aware of that really fits in here before we kind of come to the close of him getting out of it and that wonderful quote from your book? What to say about it?
Right. By the time Carnegie is really involved with the spelling movement, he's already created a number of trusts and foundations. And he forces his trustees to adopt the simplified spelling. And they do so in the beginning because he's funding these foundations and they don't have much of a say in the matter. But as they put out their, say, annual report with this changed spellings, that's when you really see a revolt start to occur. And you begin to realize that it was really only a minority of people. There may have been, scholars from Columbia, Yale, Oxford University on board with this movement, but even so, it was a minority because the people serving on many of Carnegie's foundation's boards were these same academics. They moved in the same circles. So I think that gives you an idea that it was a minority of people pushing for it.
People that could see the implicate value of making this more learnable, more usable in terms of the extension and participation around the world of the language, or the degree to which even children and adults in the United States would be able to acquire literacy. But you had to think pretty implicatly, and you had to care about people that, I mean, for the most part, the people in high society, the people that were illiterate didn't exist. They didn't exist to the same degree. So you had to care about them and see the connection to this problem to have any kind of passion for it. I would imagine that at least in our studies, that very few people did, that weren't in positions to understand the effect of it.
Right, the working class, certainly when they would read about this movement in the newspaper, would scoff at it. Most of them weren't reading and writing to much of a degree anyway. And then when you look at the academics, the circle Carnegie was traveling in, for many of those people, it was an attack on civilization itself. It was not progressive to them at all.
Okay, anything else in this space before we go?
That's really, I think, it. Just, like you said, it just starts to die out. And in 1915 is when he pulls the plug, so we can jump to that.
He hung in it for about 8 years after it peaked, really.
Right. Carnegie was one of those men that when he went down a path, he just kept going. He couldn't let go, especially when he tied his name to it. So he was out there 7, 8 years after many of his cohorts and supporters had dropped off. And it's in 1915 that he finally says, enough is enough. And he spells enough, E-N-U-F, in a letter to a friend. But he had it, so he no longer is going to contribute $25,000 a year. He says, I've got better ways to spend that money.
Then he has this kind of a summation statement for the group.
Right. His summation was that never a more useless body of men have come into association. And that was his rap on it.
Good. And was he the kind of guy like Roosevelt? I understand Roosevelt got really charged by this, and once he realized it was over, it was over. It didn't linger with him. He continued to write in particular ways that reflected his sense of it, but it wasn't one of those things that he carried around with great regret or weight. I wish this would have worked. In Roosevelt's case, how did this die off finally in Carnegie? Even after he pulled up the money, was this still something that he felt was a really good thing that fizzled and didn't work, and it was their fault?
Well, he was Carnegie, when he finally did pull the plug, was quick to blame other people, never himself. And it was always really difficult for him to let go of things. So he shut it down, but with quite a bit of bitterness. And it always weighed on his mind afterward. He died in 1918. So, well, yeah, you can cut that out of there.
But again, no, that's right. So he really saw this equation: world peace is connected to our ability to communicate. The language we want to be the language of the world, so we can communicate it, is English. And English is very difficult, if not the most difficult language to learn to read and write in. Simplifying spelling, therefore, simplifies and extends the dimension of access to this fundamental layer of communication, which is got a fulcrum effect on world peace.
Right, and when World War I breaks out in 1914, the way Carnegie's mind worked was he would say to you, look, if we had carried this through, we may have stopped the World War. That's the way he worked.
Referring to simplified spelling.
Right. Right.
Wow.
Could you say that again and put that in?
Right.
So is it an oblique reference?
Right. When World War I broke out in 1914, the way Carnegie's mind worked was that if the simplified spelling movement had continued, we might have prevented the Great War. And that's the way he thought.
Yeah, that makes sense. These are fulcrum thinkers.
Well, also, one of the other driving forces for him was that he was a race imperialist, which doesn't mean he was a racist. What he meant was that the Anglo-Saxons should really be dictating a global policy. and built into that was the world language. So I don't know if you're including any race imperialism in this section of the program.
We were actually talking about language imperialism, which is,
Mm-hmm.
you got that in it. That's an interesting point. And it's also interesting when you think about it that despite all of the difficulties with English that everybody was afraid of, I mean, it has become what they wanted it to become.
You know, yeah, this is an aside, but I love to travel to Europe, you know. So when I was over there like 4 years ago, I was in Germany, and like all the popular magazines for the young people are in English. And yet, you know, when you listen to the young people talk, you know, they're like, America, you know, we hate you, you're always trying to impose your values on us. But there were all the magazines, the business and the cultural magazines were all in English in Germany.
The cultural / entertainment, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that, you knew like American movies were big there,
Yeah.
but I couldn't believe it that there were these German publications in English.
Yeah. That has become it's now the law in China that your children will learn to read English.
Is it?
Yeah, national policy. The adults, there are 100 million adults struggling to learn to read English because they know it's the key to their cultural family success path.
Yeah, and it couldn't be much different, huh?
Anything else you want to add in this space? It's been wonderful.
No, I wish I had more for you, but I think you have more than I know. I was always talking about him in the bigger picture of things, but I think I hit all the highlights.
Good.
I have a question. Can you speak at all to Carnegie and libraries?
Mm-hmm.
Was it,
Yeah, that was always, I would go to libraries. I mean, that's all we talked about. So, let's see. When Carnegie was the first tycoon to publicly come out with a template for philanthropy. And in his template, he had a hierarchy of giving. And at the top was universities, which he wasn't particularly interested in because that would be catering to already an elite class of people that could afford to go to universities, that had the education to go. Number 2 on his list was public libraries. And the reason libraries were so very important to him was that he felt that he could touch the broadest base of people by funding libraries. For example, in New York, he gave enough money to build 60 plus libraries. He wanted you in New York City to be able to walk out your door, go 2 blocks, and be at a library. Because he thought that was the best way to uplift humanity, the best way to educate the working class. Now, in the beginning, of course, the working class didn't have the money or time to go visit a library. They didn't have the luxury. But what you find is 2 or 3 generations removed, say in the 1930s, that's when all of a sudden there is really an educational revolution that's caused to a great degree by the many, many Carnegie libraries that are now in the United States. So people are now going to libraries, they're educating themselves, they're learning how to read better, and Carnegie was really a driving force behind that.
And this explains in some degree his listening openness to Dewey's letter, coming from a head librarian who's done something significant in the field of libraries.
Well, when Carnegie was growing up, he only had 2 years or so of grade school, which was pretty standard for the day. And when he came to the United States, there was a man in the suburb of Pittsburgh where he lived that had made a fortune in iron and had a wonderful personal library, which he opened up to the working class boys of Pittsburgh. And Carnegie was introduced to this man, and in his off hours, Carnegie lived in this library and essentially educated himself. And so that's the kind of opportunity he wanted to give to other people.
So in that sense, he would have been a real champion of literacy in the way that many literacy organizations function today. But rather than focusing on learning the skill in the abstract, his sense was make sure there's lots to read everywhere.
Right. He would fund the library building itself, but the various towns that applied for a library and received one from him were in charge of supplying the books, which was brilliant on his part because they had to make the investment, and also they would provide the books that they thought most appropriate for their community.
You said about 60 in New York. Do you have a number of what his funding was behind total?
Oh man, I can look it up for you.
Or how many libraries total?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I have the exact figure. It was almost 3,000. Do you want the exact figure? I mean,
approximate numbers, okay.
Okay. When Carnegie made library giving his centerpiece, he funded the construction of almost 3,000 libraries, not just in the United States, but in English-speaking countries around the world.
Anyone even come close? Being individually involved with the funding of development?
No. What's interesting though is this is an aside, but the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they provide computer rooms to libraries. So it's kind of fun. You go to these Carnegie libraries, and then inside one of them you have the Gates computer room. So he's obviously, gonna be close to the same sort of thing. But there you go. Everyone says, oh, Gates is doing this wonderful thing with this foundation, but all the cynics and critics say, yeah, because he's going to sell the software that's going to go into all those computers that he's giving to these libraries. And in 2 years' time, it's all going to be obsolete, so they're going to have to buy new software. So it's the same thing.
Yeah, seed crystalling the market, right?
Yeah.
Seeding the addiction.
Exactly, yeah.
Like Apple in schools.
Right, yeah.
Good. This has been delightful. Anything else? And we've covered everything I was interested in. I mean, I saw the jewels go clip, clip, clip in my head as we were...
Well, hopefully you'll get a few lines out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole simplified spelling thing is going to take, on the broadcast, maybe 10 minutes or something. It's not going to be long.
Yeah.
But I want to expand this into 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how it works in the DVD series.
Mm-hmm.
People can really understand what happened between, 1650, actually 1450, and 1918. That window there, when it begins to get stabilized, the printing press, the reaction to the mess, the attempts to fix it, and then the folly. It's just folly. Are you kidding? You don't even think about it anymore.
Yeah. Well, I love, when you get into Twain and there's the letter about the revolutions and violence, and he spells it all phonetically. It's hysterical. Twain was so brilliant. One of the next books I really want to do is Twain and like his relationship with like a Thomas Edison, and just because I love Twain, but I gotta work him in a different way because so much has been done on him. I would love to just have 2 years to just read Twain. That's the goal. Is like, can you figure out a project where you can just do whatever you want for a couple of years?
I'm trying to do that too.
Yeah. Well, you're going, huh? Now, are you working the internet email into this at all?
Oh, internet email, what do you mean?
Well, in the sense that the language is being corrupted by email.
Well, corrupted, or it's going through another morph towards a variation of simplification.
Right.
Because of the small, and the same thing with these cell phones and
Right.
messaging in general.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of people up in arms, I think, especially with the young people who, have simplified their spelling on, their instant messaging, in particular, emails. I do it too. I never spell through OUGH anymore. It's always THRU. Even in letters now.
The idea of having such a mass-scale writing and intercommunication system as email, without having the formal expectations on it, right, has led to a lot. So that plus the decreased footprint. One of the metaphors we used earlier in this is that we call the basic problem the first millennium bug. The takeoff after Y2K, being that we got into all this trouble and world scare because a handful of programmers didn't think past a few years because they were in such a small little space.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how these technical constraints changed the writing system, changed the language so much.
Yeah.
So actually, one of the people we interviewed is Professor Naomi Barron at American University. She wrote a book called From Alphabet to Email, which she studies 250,000 college students' instant messages.
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty
And finds
interesting.
very few spelling mistakes. That they are kind of changing some of their.
Really?
They're kind of having some spellings of their own, but in
Right,
general,
right.
their spelling mistakes are very minimal.
Inside the conventions that are emerging, they're solid.
Yeah, yeah. We'll see what happens.
Okay? All right, let's wrap.